Ebenezer Scrooge, a name you probably recognize, but did you know his character was based on a real person? You have probably noticed when you're scrolling online that half of the videos are telling you how to get rich and the other half are showing how you can spend your riches once you've made them. Well, today we're going in the opposite direction and looking at the lives of some of the most famous misers in history. Those people who made unimaginable fortunes but refused to enjoy their wealth, sometimes living in states of destitution despite having millions in the bank. We're starting this series with John Elwes, probably not a name you recognize, but he is one of the most famous misers in history, so much so that Charles Dickens based the character of Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol on him. So, who was John Elwes? This handsome chap was born in London in 1714. He was born into a wealthy family of successful brewers and politicians, and was raised between a grand townhouse in London and Marchant Park, the family's country estate in Berkshire. His early life included a fancy education at Westminster School, followed by a spell in Geneva. However, despite the early opulence of his life, his later years were far removed from this lifestyle. John's father, Robert Megott, we'll come to why they had different surnames shortly, died in 1718 when John was only 4 years old. His mother inherited a fortune of £100,000, which equates to £19 million in 2025, but she apparently lived in perpetual fear that she would fall into poverty once her husband had died. Too scared to spend any of the family fortune, Amy Megott slowly starved herself to death, and within several years of his father's death, John also lost his mother. As the only son, John inherited the family estate and became a millionaire. After the death of his mother, John was taken under the wing of his mother's brother, his uncle, Sir Hervey Elwes. Sir Hervey Elwes was the Earl of Bristol, a blue-blooded member of the landed gentry and a member of Parliament. Because Sir Hervey was childless, he made a deal with his young nephew. If the young John Megott changed his name to John Elwes, he would inherit the entire estate on the death of Sir Hervey. This wasn't an uncommon agreement in this period of history, and John Megott quickly agreed and became John Elwes. Much like his sister, Sir Hervey had several peculiarities, particularly in relation to money. He prided himself on spending no more than £110 each year, despite his income being more than 100 times this amount. He was described by the papers of the time as being perhaps the most perfect picture of human penury that ever existed. Despite living at the Grand Stoke Park estate, his interests were few and far between, and he lived his life as a miser. These early experiences, a mother who starved herself to death rather than paying for food, and an uncle who lived in poverty despite his vast fortune, were the core lessons of the formative years for young John Elwes. Then, on the 22nd of October 1763, Sir Hervey Elwes died, leaving his entire estate to John Elwes. The estate amounted to £250,000, or £42 million when adjusted for inflation in 2025. This £42 million, in addition to the £19 million inherited from his parents, meant that John, with £61 million, was now one of the richest men in the world. Unlike millionaires of today, John didn't splurge his wealth on great extravagances. Instead, he fell into a pit of miserliness from which he never emerged. Tales from the time described John as a perfect gentleman, polite and kind to a fault. However, balancing out his gentlemanly conduct was a life of miserly conduct. So infamous was John's parsimonious conduct that when a visitor asked a village boy for directions to the house of John Elwes, the boy replied, "He lives in the pauper's house down the lane." Some of John's idiosyncrasies of character include walking 17 miles from his country house in Essex to London to save the cost of a coach. Additionally, on the walk, he refused to stop for refreshment at the various coaching inns, preferring instead to feast on 2 hard-boiled eggs and some scraps of dry pancake which he carried with him in his pocket. On one of these many journeys between London and his country estate, John was said to have found a wig in the gutter which had been discarded by a tramp. It was customary for gentlemen to wear wigs in this time period, and John duly recovered the wig and proudly wore it for the rest of the year, until it finally disintegrated. That is, one of the richest men in England wearing a wig that a tramp had considered too careworn for further use. In fact, John's wardrobe itself was very limited. His clothes were so worn that he was often mistaken for a tramp himself, and occasionally people approached him in the street to put coins in his hands, so that he could afford to feed himself. Once, when his clothes had become so worn that even he considered them beyond use, he'd ventured into the loft at his country hall and found an old chest that had belonged to his grandfather, and which was full of his old clothes. From that day forward, John was seen wearing aged breeches and a green velvet coat, all of which were at least a century out of fashion. Despite the incredulity from his friends, John continued unabated, preferring economy to extravagance. By 1762, it was estimated that John was worth a staggering £500,000, which equates to £88 million in 2025 when adjusted for inflation. By refusing to spend any of his vast fortune on himself, and by continually adding to his land and property holdings, including vast country estates in Berkshire, Essex and Sussex, and building hundreds of residential properties in central London for rent, John was rapidly becoming one of the wealthiest men in Europe. However, not everything John touched turned to gold. It seems he was a very trusting individual, which, when coupled to a poor business instinct, meant he lost significant sums on doomed business projects. He was said to have invested £25,000 in American Iron Works, which ultimately only existed in the mind of the scam artist, which sold the idea to John. Additionally, he lost even more by lending money to individuals only to never have it repaid. It was estimated by his biographer that John lost £150,000 in his lifetime from poor investments and outright frauds. That equates to £26 million when adjusted for inflation. Despite such setbacks, John continued with his usual equanimity of mind and was actually elected as a Member of Parliament for Berkshire, where he sat for 3 terms, and was apparently considered one of the most honest politicians of the day. After his stint as an MP, John was offered a peerage by the king, but turned it down because it would necessitate the buying of a carriage rather than walking or riding his horse, and the thought of the expense almost killed him. The offer from the king was promptly, yet politely, turned down, and instead of Sir John Elwes, he simply remained John. Despite his ever-expanding wealth, the compound effect of earning 100 times more than he spent each year and reinvesting the difference meant John, upon leaving Parliament, was worth £800,000, or £140 million when adjusted for inflation. He didn't ease up on his parsimony. Instead, from all reports of the time, as John became ever wealthier, he so became even more determined to not spend any money at all. His houseguests tell stories of having to retire to bed as soon as the sun set so as to avoid the use of candles. Additionally, if John was ever caught in the rain, he would simply sit in wet clothes to save the expense of lighting a fire. This despite his estate providing all the wood he could ever burn in a dozen lifetimes. Another houseguest tells a story of a rat pulling a half-eaten moorhen from a river and John chasing away the rats so as to recover the half-eaten bird. The moorhen was served for dinner that evening. John's tenant farmers also told stories of him crawling through the fields during harvest season so that he could pick up and spilled corn and save himself the expense of buying any. This, in addition to living on game birds which he caught on his estate and fish from his lake, meant he was able to live for almost no cost whatsoever. Toward the end of his life, John proudly announced that he was living on less than £50 a year. This despite his income running to more than £50,000 a year at the time. Despite being one of the wealthiest men in Europe and owning 2 significant country estates, John refused to spend any money on their maintenance, allowing them to fall to rack and ruin. It was reported by guests that these country houses were largely dilapidated. Most windows were broken and held together with brown paper. The roofs had holes, and more than one guest was woken from their sleep by rainfall hitting them in the night, and the food served was often described as putrid. This extreme parsimony almost cost John his life. On one of his frequent trips to London, John refused to pay for lodgings and instead decided to sleep in an unoccupied barn. During this stay, he became ill and lay undiscovered in the barn for 3 days. It was only by pure luck that John's nephew had heard he was in town and went looking for him. Upon discovery, a doctor was called, and John survived the encounter. his behavior continued unabated. John's parsimony continued to grow, as did his fortune. In 1789 his wealth was estimated at £950,000, or £166 million when adjusted for inflation. It was in the year 1789 that John died and bequeathed his entire estate to his two sons. Little is now known about the subsequent lives of his sons, but, as is often the case, the grandchildren of John Elwes didn't inherit so significant an estate as their parents did. If you would like to learn more about the famous Miss Elwes, a book was written in 1790 by Edward Topham, which provides more detail about his life, and is now available to download for free. The book describes John as chiefly an enemy to himself, but to all those around him he was always an impeccable gentleman. It always seems fascinating to me that misers such as John Elwes live in parsimony to accumulate great fortunes, which are subsequently squandered by the descendants, seemingly never learning these lessons from history. Anyway, I hope you found the story of John Elwes interesting, and that you'll join me for more of the same soon. Thank you.